There's a good reason to study therapies. There are all kinds of different therapies, and what therapy is right for one person isn't necessarily right for another person. I would also tell you that there is no one therapy that works with all types of problems and all types of clients. We're going to get an overview of some of the major approaches to therapy. I used to teach counseling at St. Edward's University, and our textbook there covered about maybe 10 of the major approaches to therapy, but in reality, there are all kinds of approaches to therapy. Most therapists are what we call eclectic. In other words, they take a little bit from one therapy and a little bit from another therapy, and they kind of roll it into their own approach. I think a good therapist is also flexible enough so that they will adapt their approach to therapy to the type of problem that the client is presenting. For example, behavior therapy works the best for treating panic disorders. Remember back when we were studying classical conditioning, I told you that about 85% of panic disorders are classically conditioned, and consequently, that's the most effective way to also get rid of them. So, one of the reasons we study all these different approaches to therapies is because, let's say you might need counseling someday, or maybe a good friend does. You might have an idea of what type of therapist you would want to go to. Because again, not all therapies and all therapists are right for every person. I'd like to begin by reading you a little story that I often read to certain clients that I felt like needed to hear it. Here's the story. Once upon a time, there was a little princess who was very pretty, bright and cheerful. She lived with her parents, the king and queen, in a beautiful castle. They were so happy to have such a wonderful child that they did everything for her. She didn't have to work, face problems, or save her money. Everything came easy for her. She always had the best clothes, the best grades, the cutest boyfriends. At school, she made A's without working, was the homecoming queen, and was on the student council. She got used to life being like a fairy tale. The only thing she missed was being an adult, because then she could enjoy living her fairy tale as a wife, lover, mother, and grown-up citizen. She didn't hope she would be gloriously happy. She expected it. After all, she had never known anything different. To her, it wasn't a fairy tale, it was life. Well, when she became old enough, she left Mommy and Daddy's castle. She moved into a castle with the handsome prince. Well, at least she thought he was the handsome prince, for he was a football star in school, was very popular, and had a great deal of potential in business. But the expected happily ever after was neither happy nor ever after. She found out, to her anger and amazement, that she was expected to do the palace dishes and to clean the 50 palace rooms. She also discovered that the handsome prince was handsome to other princesses besides her, and even to women who weren't princesses at all. He also enjoyed drinking the palace wine, which he did all the time, even when there wasn't a royal ball. Well, she had always been a very bright princess, so she thought and thought, finally came up with the only logical conclusion: wrong prince. So she packed up, left the castle, and searched for another prince. 3 royal weddings later, she still hadn't changed her conclusion. Still the wrong prince. It was amazing to her how many toads were disguised as princes these days. For the first time in her life, she was unhappy. So what does a princess do when she's out of sorts? She seeks out a wizard to solve her problem for her. So she went to many royal psychologists looking for the magic solution to her problems. But alas, they lacked the magic. She was passive and didn't work at what the wizards had told her, because one shouldn't have to work at magic. One should simply receive it. If you put out effort, it's not magic, just work. Well, anyway, one day when she was particularly depressed, she started to think about her life in a totally new and different way. For the first time, it occurred to her that maybe life wasn't a fairy tale. Maybe she was not just an unlucky princess cursed by some evil witch. Maybe she wasn't a princess at all. And nobody else was either. Initially, she felt even more depressed about her insight, for the colorful, romantic world of fairy tales was being replaced by a world of dull shades of gray. Princes and princesses are a lot more exciting than just plain humans. But gradually she realized that the world of just plain humans was, in a way, more interesting, because despite the pain, boredom, and failures, there were also successes. And unlike the fairy tales, the successes were due to human effort. In the fables, you were born a princess, you were guaranteed happiness, and you didn't have to supply any effort. Any happiness you achieved was due to fate, not to effort. There's no satisfaction in gaining something that fate has decreed. But in the human world, your gains and failures are mostly due to your own efforts, and there are no guarantees of anything. She also saw how the fairy tale destroyed her relationships. Spouses aren't handsome princes. They are humans with all the weaknesses, pettiness, and imperfections of any human who is struggling in a sometimes hard and painful world. If we visualize a lover magically, and if we base this image on an ancient fairy tale, we immeasurably cheapen and malign the love we have for each other. The dignity of spouses who have spent their lives together does not show that fate preordained their relationship to work, but that they made it work without a guarantee of success. The task is arduous enough for anyone, but it becomes impossible if the couple's roadmap is an ancient fairy tale. Well, the reason that I like to read that to certain clients is so many people coming in for the first time are like this princess, and that is she expects some royal psychologist to fix things for her. In fact, this whole thing is kind of based on what we would call the medical model. And the medical model kind of works like this. You are a patient who is sick, and I am a doctor, and I'm going to heal you. That's the medical model. When you're not feeling well, you go to the doctor, you're the patient, and the doctor is going to heal you by prescribing some medication or doing surgery or whatever. And of course, the medical model is what psychoanalysis is based on. This is Sigmund Freud. He was a physician, a psychiatrist, an MD. And his approach to therapy is based on the medical model. And what a good psychoanalyst would do to you is this. First of all, a good psychoanalyst in his office, and it would be a he, by the way, it wouldn't be a she, and he would have a goatee, and he would have a foreign accent, like an Austrian accent, and he would have you come into his office and lie on his couch, and he would sit in a chair behind you where you couldn't see him, and he would get you to relax and do what he calls free association. Just say whatever comes into your mind as you're relaxed there on the couch. You might remember from earlier in the semester when we were studying sleep, and also more recently when you studied personality theory, Freud believed that the personality resembled an iceberg. And at the tip of the iceberg is what he calls the conscious part of your personality. And then just below the waterline in what he calls the pre-conscious. But lurking deep below the surface of the iceberg in what Freud calls the unconscious is where shameful experiences reside, violent motives you might have, sexual fantasies, horrible experiences you've had. One of the ways that we deal with these terrible events and these terrible thoughts, according to the psychoanalyst, is by repressing these things into our unconscious so we're not aware of them. But psychoanalysts believe that much of our behavior, much of our feelings, much of our emotions are motivated by what's in the unconscious. And so the goal of the psychoanalyst is to explore the unconscious, to bring this information from the unconscious up to consciousness so you can become aware of that. And one of the ways to do that is by lying on their couch and relaxing and freely associating. Another thing that can be done is, sleep. Well, no, I shouldn't say sleep. I should say, dream analysis would be a better thing to say. The psychoanalyst, again, would be seated behind you on his couch, and he would get you to share your dreams with him. And remember, according to Freud, dreams always symbolize something else. And so then the psychoanalyst would interpret those dreams as what's in your unconscious that's motivating your behavior. And if that's not working, they might also try hypnosis. Regressive hypnosis as another way of getting to this information in the unconscious. Something that psychoanalysts like to have happen during a session is what's known as a transference reaction. And what transference is an event that happens that suddenly reminds you of something that's in your unconscious. Let me share with you an event that happened with me one time where I was leading group therapy in the hospital. I don't know, how many of you have ever seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? I've got a link on Blackboard here to a key scene from that movie. The patients in this mental hospital are in group therapy, and the main therapist is a nurse by the name of Nurse Ratched, and she's a very kind of uncaring, rigid individual. If you ever see the whole movie, you're hoping the whole bunch of patients will rise up against Nurse Ratched. Anyway, I was doing group therapy in the hospital, and my co-therapist was a Nurse Ratched clone. And there was a patient in the hospital who was, this was a guy, he was a truck driver, and he was a big guy. He would, had been big enough to play in the defensive line for the Dallas Cowboys, I think. Anyway, he had been very depressed, and he was in the hospital because his son had died when the little boy was, maybe 5 or 6 years of age. I want to say cancer or something like that. Anyway, we're in group therapy, and this fellow is describing his remorse over losing his son, and he's going into detail about after his son died. He was so preoccupied thinking about his son that he wasn't paying attention to what he was doing with his truck, and he was backing his 18-wheeler into an alley, and he ran over a gas main and just about blew up the truck and the building and everything else. And anyway, he was going into all these details when all of a sudden my co-therapist, Nurse Ratchet Clone, said, "Will you get to the point?" And he stopped what he was doing, and he finished what he was saying, and he got up and started walking out of the room. Well, normally you would be very supportive of your co-therapist, but it really bothered me that Nurse Ratchet had said these things to this hospital patient. And so I decided to come to his defense, and as he was walking out of the room, I said, "Don't go." And he immediately stopped, stood in front of me, clicked his heels together, and saluted me. And he said, "Yes, sir, yes, sir." And then he went, "You remind me of my dad." And if you can imagine this great big guy standing over me, and I'm sitting in a chair, I thought, is he going to beat me up or what? And then he stormed out of the room. And I told Nurse Ratchet, "Okay, you keep running group. I'm going to follow him up and see what's going on." And when I had a one-on-one session with this gentleman out in the hall, what I found out was when he was growing up, his dad was an Army officer and was never there for him. He was always off fighting some battle somewhere or getting stationed in some other country, and so his dad was never there going to his Little League baseball games or his things that went on at school and so on. And it bothered him. And he said, "When you said to me, 'Don't go,' I looked at you and I saw my dad, the Army officer, and that's why I started clicking my heels together and saluting you and saying, 'Yes, sir, yes, sir.'" And what came of this session was not just that he was grieving the loss of his son. Anyone would grieve the loss of a dying child. But he was determined to have the kind of relationship with his son that he never had with his dad. And now that his son was gone, the opportunity to have that didn't exist anymore. That's what we call transference. Had it not been for that transference reaction, we were headed the wrong way with our therapy with this gentleman. We were just helping him deal with, the loss of a child, when in fact we had to also address the fact that he never had a healthy relationship with his own dad, and he was determined to be the kind of dad that he didn't have. Another term you have to watch out for here, though, is countertransference. And what countertransference is when the patient reminds you, the therapist, of someone from your past. So, it wouldn't do any good if I said to him, "Well, I might remind you of your dad. You remind me of that bully that threw snowballs at my head on the way home from school, you big jerk." This isn't helping the patient get better. So you have to be very careful about countertransference as well. The next type of therapy I want to talk about here is called Gestalt therapy. And the father of Gestalt therapy is someone by the name of Fritz Perls. and he's another psychiatrist. And I always say you can spot a Gestalt therapist by a lot of the terms they like to use. And one of their favorite ones is unfinished business. Gestalt therapy is kind of an offshoot of psychoanalysis. And a Gestalt therapist would say that this gentleman I just talked about had a lot of unfinished business with his dad. Things that he has always wanted to say to his dad and never has. The other way to really spot a Gestalt therapist is they focus almost completely on feelings. They undergo what I call emotional catharsis. Most of the co-therapists that I had in the hospital